Have you ever found yourself in a seemingly hopeless chess position with your opponent on the brink of victory? Fear not, as today we'll be exploring 10 ways to save the game in chess. Whether it's through sacrificing material, creating counterplay, or utilizing endgame techniques, we'll give you the tools to turn the game around and secure a draw or even a win. So sit tight and get ready to learn some tips that could save you from defeat. Tip number 1 is to create counterplay. Counterplay is essential when you're in a difficult position. Instead of playing passively and waiting for your opponent to capitalize on their advantage, actively seek opportunities to create threats and attack your opponent. So for example, in this position, Black is currently 1 pawn down and his king is stuck in the center of the board because he can't castle anymore. So instead of playing normal waiting moves like bishop e7 or pushing some of his pawns up, Black plays the very aggressive rook takes g2, seeking for counterplay. It's also important to note that you have to calculate the correct moves when looking for counterplay, because in this position, even though the move bishop h3 looks really nice for Black, because utilizing the pin on the g file, the pawn on g2 is now under attack, and if White pushes the pawn up, Black would just capture the rook on f1. However, here, this move doesn't work because after knight to e1, the knight defends the pawn on g2, and if you sacrifice to create counterplay now, after knight takes, queen to h3, threatening checkmate in 1, White has a nice defensive resource with queen to d5, and the queen defends the knight on g2, and now Black is just completely losing because the attack has been stopped. So rook takes g2 was the correct idea, and after king takes g2, bishop h3 check, the king has to go back to h1 because both king g1 or king g3 falls to queen to g4. So king h1, now Black recaptures the bishop, queen takes, and now queen f5. The queen has a double attack on the bishop and the knight, and Black will regain the piece. So after a move like queen to g2, queen takes f6, and now Black has managed to get back the pawn that he lost, and even though his position is still slightly worse because the Black king cannot castle, whereas White's king is safely tucked in the corner, with a counter blow move like rook takes g2 earlier on, Black manages to equalize the material and he still has chances in the game. Next, let's take a look at tip number 2, which is sacrifices. A well-timed sacrifice can disrupt your opponent's plans and give you chances for a comeback. Consider sacrificing material to expose your opponent's king to launch a deadly attack. So, for example, in this position, White is down a whole rook and 1 pawn. White only has the queen and 2 knights left for the attack, and the only move that wins for White here is by playing knight takes g6 check. If White played any other move, for example, queen to h4, threatening to checkmate on h7, this would be a blunder because now Black can defend with pawn to h5, and after knight capture on e6, pawn captures, knight takes g6, king to g8, White recaptures the Black rook, takes queen to g5 check, king f7, queen takes, king takes f6, and here White has no more attacking piece besides the queen, and Black is just completely winning with 1 extra bishop in the endgame. So White had to be precise and sacrifice with knight takes g6 check, because now if pawn takes, White has queen to h4 check, followed by mate on h7. And after the f pawn captured the knight, White has pawn to f7, and this is checkmate because the king has no squares to go, and the only way Black can defend this check is by sacrificing his bishop, sacrificing his queen, and then checkmate. The next tip is to look for perpetual check. In some positions, you can save a lost game by forcing perpetual check, and if your opponent king cannot escape the checks, it will lead to a draw, allowing you to escape with half a point. So for example, in this position, White is down 2 pieces, a bishop and a knight, for 3 pawns after a failed sacrifice on the king side. However, White still has a perpetual check to force the game into a draw, even though he's 2 whole pieces behind. So after queen check, Black is forced to repeat the positions and White can escape with a draw. Tip number 4, is try to swindle your opponent. So swindling is a tactic where you trick your opponent into making a mistake, often by creating a sudden, unexpected threat. So look for opportunities to set up traps for your opponent, especially in complex or unclear positions. So in this position, it's black to play and black plays the move pawn to d2. As you guys can see on the evaluation bar over here, it shows that black is completely winning, -4, because the black pawn is 1 square away from queening and white has no rear counterplay in this position. However, white tries to create a trap and swindle his opponent by playing the move rook to e3. This move invites black to play the really powerful move queen to c1, and it looks like black is going to win the game in the next few moves. So black plays the move queen to c1, but unfortunately for black, this is a terrible blunder, as you guys can see from the evaluation bar jumping on the left side, because white has a brilliant double exclamation move sacrifice with queen takes h7 check, forcing the black recapture with the king, and rook h3 is checkmate. So instead of playing queen to c1, now we can see the whole idea of white playing rook to e3 was to swing the rook over, giving checkmate after sacrificing the queen. So in this position, black had to play bishop to d3, blocking the rook. The bishop attacks the queen, and the bishop also now defends the square on h7. And in this position, white is just completely lost, because after a move like queen to g4, now black can play queen to c1 and white cannot capture the queen. Otherwise, black would just recapture and promote to another queen with back rank mate. And if white tries for counterplay with rook to g3, threatening mate in 1 on g7, black can just capture the rook on d1, queen capture, and bishop c2, and this is just completely losing for white already, because after queen takes, black can just promote into another queen, and this is back rank mate. But before we continue, we hope you're enjoying these chess tips. If you're finding this content helpful, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps us to continue to create more chess content for you. Now let's talk about the next 2 tips. Tip number 5 is Desperado. When facing with a seemingly lost position, you can sometimes employ the Desperado tactic, where you can use your doomed piece to create chaos on the board, which potentially complicate the position and increase the chances of your opponent making a mistake. And tip number 6 is utilizing stalemate tricks. Stalemate is a situation where the player to move has no legal moves and is not in check at the same time. So if you can force a stalemate, the game is drawn. Now let's take a look at an example that showcases these 2 tricks. So in this position, it's white to play, and as you guys can see from the evaluation bar, it's completely losing for white. White cannot capture the knight on f4 because rook to e2 check after king h1, queen g2 would be checkmate. So in this position, white plays pawn to h4, and after rook e2 check, king h1, black plays the very natural queen takes g3, followed by lots of checkmate threats. However, in this position, white finds a brilliant Desperado move with queen to g8 check, double exclamation mark, sacrificing the whole queen. Black is forced to capture the queen because if he plays his king up, either queen takes g7 or queen h8 check will come. So after king captures the queen, now here comes the second brilliant Desperado move with rook takes g7 check. The whole idea of these 2 moves with the sacrifices is that black cannot capture the white's rook with either the king or the queen, because after capturing, white's king will be in stalemate, as white's king is not in check and he will have no legal moves. For example, let's say queen takes g7. This position is a draw because all of white's pawns has no moves and the king has no legal move as well. So black cannot capture the rook and is forced to move the king sideways. But white can just keep on giving checks like this, and at any point in time, if black captures the rook, the position will be in stalemate. So the black king can try to move sideways, but white will keep on giving checks, and this game is just a draw because black will never be able to capture the white rook due to stalemate. So this is such a brilliant example showcasing Desperado and utilizing stalemate tricks at the same time. Now let's move on to the tips for the endgame. And tip number 7 is to trade pieces to reach a drawn endgame. In some cases, you can save a game by trading pieces and entering an endgame that is theoretically drawn, even if you're down material. So examples include opposite colored bishops or rook and pawn versus rook endgames. So for example, in this position, black should definitely trade the rooks because this would allow the position to transform into an opposite colored bishop endgame. And theoretically, opposite colored bishop endgames are usually drawn, even though in this case, white has an extra pawn. And in some cases, opposite colored bishops are also drawn even though one side is up 2 pawns. So by understanding which positions are theoretically drawn, you should try to trade pieces and reach that scenario because it would increase your chances of getting a draw when you're down material in the endgame. The next tip is to create a fortress. A fortress is a defensive setup that is difficult or almost impossible for your opponent to break through. When under attack, consider arranging your pieces to create a solid defensive structure that can withstand your opponent's threats and potentially lead to a draw. So, for example, in this position, this setup with the rook and the pawn over here like this is a well-known fortress, and this position is just a draw because even though black has a queen, black will not be able to make any progress in this position. As long as white plays defensive moves, the correct defensive moves, and all white has to do in this position is to just move the rook here and move it back so that the pawn guards the rook whenever the king is not in check. So, for example, let's say black tries to check here, just move the king up, check here, you can block with the rook, or you can even play the king back because as long as the rook is protected by the pawn on either this square or this square, on f3 or on d3, the rook controls the third rank and the black's king will never be able to infiltrate as long as the rook is controlling this rank over here. And this fortress position should be an easy draw for white as long as white knows what he's doing. So whenever you're down material, you should try to set up your position and create a fortress where your opponent cannot progress to win the game. Tip number 9 is to rely on your opponent not knowing the bishop and knight checkmate. In some cases, you can save the game by reaching a position where your opponent has a bishop and knight against your lone king. Many players, even strong players with over 2000 elo, struggle to checkmate with a bishop and knight. So sacrificing your last piece for a pawn in the endgame might lead to a draw if your opponent cannot execute the checkmate. So for example, in this position, as white, you should take your chances and capture the last remaining pawn for black, sacrificing your bishop in the process, and you take a gamble by hoping that your opponent doesn't know how to checkmate with a bishop and knight. And if your opponent can't execute the checkmate properly, you will be able to escape with a draw. Last but not least, the final tip is to apply time pressure. Playing on your opponent's time pressure can increase the likelihood of them making mistakes and blundering the position. So keep making moves that require your opponent to think and calculate while you try and stay ahead on the clock, which will increase your chances of your opponent making a mistake. This is very helpful, especially in rapid or blitz games where there's no increment, and even though your opponent is up material, but if he is low on time, you can use time pressure to your advantage. And that's it for our video on 10 ways to save the game in chess. We've explored some strategies to turn the tide of a difficult game and salvage a draw, or even, in certain cases, win the game. If you found this video helpful, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more chess content. In the comments below, let us know which of the 10 ways you found the most helpful or which one was your favorite. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.